What's up, friends? Welcome to Drop Into Dr. Awesome. I am Dr. Awesome, and the world we live in now, it has never been easier to get into video production. There are just so many cameras and tools and all kinds of things available that it has become incredibly accessible. That being said, one of the problems I see with modern video content creation is it doesn't matter what kind of camera you have if you're always going to throw it into full auto and just let it do its thing. So I want to make a video talking about the basic camera functions you need to understand to really take control of your content. And while I'm not talking about one specific camera here, the things I'm going to talk about are true for all cameras, whether you're using a DSLR, a mirrorless like I'm using, a camcorder, a fancy cinema or studio camera, or even your cell phone. These are the absolute basic functions you need to understand what they are, what they do, and once you have a grasp on them, it will change your life. Now, when we're talking about these basic camera functions, the first thing we need to talk about is going to be your aspect ratio. This is literally just how big the video you're recording actually is. And there's a lot of these out there. We're not going to talk about all of them. We're going to talk about the 4 that are sort of accessible on most cameras, okay? So starting at the low end, we have good old-fashioned standard definition, which has the 4:3 aspect ratio, and your resolution is going to be 640 by 480. And this is what that would look like in a 4K environment. You can see it's a lot smaller, we're cropping it on the sides a little bit, and it doesn't quite fill the screen, right? If we then stretch this and expand this, which is what we used to do with television, you can see we can make it fill the screen, but it gets a little fuzzy, a little blurry, a little funky, right? And so you don't necessarily want to do that unless you're really planning to play it in an environment that's sort of set for that. If you're looking for nostalgia, that kind of thing. However, honestly, I would recommend shooting at a higher resolution and then adding some fuzz and some grain to make it look like this rather than trying to record like this in most cases. Stepping up from standard definition, we have high definition. Now, the first generation of high definition, your aspect ratio is going to be 16:9, and your resolution is going to be 1280 by 720. And it looks kind of like this, right? You can see now we have that widescreen format that we've all come to expect from our modern televisions, things like that, but it is still quite a bit smaller than our 4K. Again, you can expand this up, and 720 will actually fill the entire 4K environment, but it, again, loses some of its definition, right? Stepping up from 720, we have Full HD, which is 1920 by 1080. Your aspect ratio is still 16:9, but what you see here is because we have more pixels, the image is larger natively, and when you blow it up, it does look a little more happy in that 4K environment. Now, I wouldn't recommend doing this a lot. I tend to recommend shooting large and making it smaller, but you could do it if you had to. And then going from Full HD to UHD or 4K, our aspect ratio becomes 1.9 to 1, and our resolution becomes, and I have to look at this, I apologize, 3840 by 2160. And this gives us that full screen format that we're looking at now. This video is being recorded in 4K, so you can kind of see the difference in all of these things. Why does your resolution matter? Well, it really comes down to where is your video going to live, how is it going to be used. Personally, for me, I tend to recommend locking in at 1080 for most things, so that full HD, right? Because if you're putting videos on Facebook or Instagram or YouTube or any of the other sort of generic places that we put video, 1080 is about all people are going to be able to see on any kind of regular basis, unless they've got really, really good internet. And it also just looks better than 480. Now, you could record in 4K and then, like I said, compress it down to 1080. That will make all of your footage look a lot clearer, a lot crisper, a lot cleaner. But there's a caveat to that. Remember that when you are recording in 4K, the more information you're recording, the less storage space you're going to have available on your card. More pixels equals more data equals less storage space, or more storage space depending on how you're thinking about it. So just bear those things in mind. When you're first getting started, I would lock in at 1080 until you have some sort of basic plan of how to shoot with intention and things like that. And then once you've got a better handle on what you're doing, then maybe stepping up to 4K when you need to for that extra clarity. Once you've got your aspect ratio sort of set and locked in, the next thing you need to think about is going to be your frame rate. And one of the things that's really important to understand is that no camera actually records motion. They record the illusion of motion by taking a given number of still frames over a certain period of time. In most cases, that's going to be 1 second. And so the more frames per second you have, the more fluid that motion appears when you play it back on a video timeline. In the United States, we have sort of 3 accepted FPS rates. The first is going to be 24 frames a second. This is the standard frame rate for movies, right? And that goes back to film projectors, film cameras, that kind of thing. It's also the easiest to light. We'll talk about that when we start talking about exposure here in a little bit. Stepping up from 24 frames a second, we have 30 frames a second, which is the standard for television and web broadcast. Now, there are some actual scientific reasons that go into why 30 is better for like digital broadcast, but for right now, just kind of understand that 30 is the standard for TV and web because that's probably where most of your content is going to be going. Stepping up from 30, we have 60 frames per second. Now, 60 frames per second is going to be for things like sporting events, anything that has action shots in it, because again, remember, the more frames you have per second, the more fluid that motion is going to become. So anything where you need to have high fidelity motion recording, upping your frame rate is going to be a better choice. The other cool thing about 60 frames per second is that it is the first sort of frame rate where you can really play with slow motion. Now, slow motion really only works when you have enough frames to play with. So 30 and 24, there's just not enough to play with. When you try and slow that down, it looks really chunky, it looks jumpy and weird. But at 60, you can slow it down by 50%, and you still have 30 frames per second, so you can have that nice fluid, slow motion you're looking for. Now, some cameras will offer 120 or even 240 frames per second, but most entry-level cameras are going to be capped at around 60. There is something else to consider with your frame rate other than just like, what am I making, and so on and so forth. You can really get yourself into trouble if you're not checking your frame rate. If you put a 24 frame a second clip in with a 30 or 60 frame a second project, what will happen is that 24 frame a second clip will not look correct. It'll look off. And that's because your editing processor is trying to deal with frames that don't exist, and it can't add frames, right? On the other side, though, if you take a 30 or 60 frame a second clip and drop it into 24, it will look better, but it still may not look right, because what your editing software will do is it will actually remove frames to make that clip fit in with things around it. So it will look better than trying to add something with less to more, but it still won't look quite right. So you should really always try and make sure you're locking into your frame rate so that you know what you're doing. All right, so we've talked about aspect and we've talked about, frame rate. The next thing we talk about is going to be sort of a 2-for-1 deal because we're talking about exposure. And there are 2 things that control your exposure for your camera. The first thing is going to be your f-stop or aperture, and then the second thing is your shutter speed. On its face, f-stop is pretty simple. The lower your f-stop, the smaller that number is, the wider your camera's aperture becomes, letting in more light. If you then crank it down, the higher that number becomes, the smaller the aperture becomes, letting in less light, right? Pretty simple on its face. But it's important to note that your f-stop also controls your camera's depth of field. The more open that f-stop, the more light's coming in, the shallower your depth of field becomes, and the inverse is true. When you close that f-stop down, you let less light in, your f-stop, your depth of field gets a little wider, right? And so, if you're curious what depth of field actually is, that's a really good question. The short answer is the depth of field is the difference between the nearest and furthest objects in a given shot that can both be considered to be in focus. And so if I put my hand here, you can see that we're both kind of in focus. But if I open up my f-stop and adjust my exposure so we don't blow this out, what you'll see is, depending on where I told the camera to focus, either my hand or my face becomes blurry, and you can't really have both of them in at the same time. Now if I close that f-stop back down, I let a little less light in, and again adjust my exposure, what you'll see is now we're both in focus again, or at least close to in focus. I'm shooting about f5.6 here, so my hand should be in focus, but it may be a little soft compared to my face, but that's what's going on. Moving on from f-stop, if you've got it locked into a place that you want it to be, but you need more or less light, this is where shutter speed comes in. Now, whether you're using a mechanical shutter or a digital shutter, it doesn't matter. Shutter speed does the same thing on every camera. This is the length of time the sensor is actually exposed to light, giving your actual recording a recording. The slower your shutter speed, the more light's coming into the camera. The quicker your shutter speed, the less light's coming in, which seems pretty simple. This is measured in fractions of a second, and so if you need more light, you just crank it down. If you need less light, you just crank it up, and you're good to go, right? But like f-stop, shutter speed also controls something else. Shutter speed controls your camera's motion blur. And one of the things to consider about motion blur is that it's not bad. Everything we see in everyday life has motion blur because of the way we see. But you can overdo it or underdo it, and it looks really funky. So if you take something that has way too much motion blur, it looks really trippy. If you take something that doesn't have any motion blur, it looks really kind of uncomfortable and weird, right? It doesn't work the way you want it to. Now, there is a time and place for both of those things, but in general, what you want to try and do is capture true-to-life motion blur. And to do that, what you do is you want to set your f-stop wherever you want it, and then you set your shutter speed, and you want your shutter speed to be double that of your frame rate. So if you're shooting at 24 frames a second, you want your shutter speed to be 1/48th or 1/50th of a second. If you're shooting at 30 frames a second, you want it to be 1/60th. If you're shooting at 60 frames a second, you want it to be 1/120th of a second. And so this comes back to, I said 24 frames is the easiest to light, because as you up your frame rate, your base level shutter speed to get that true-to-life motion blur is going to inherently make the image that you're recording darker. And this is why these two things work in concert. You have to find the balance between f-stop and shutter speed to really get what you're going for. A lot of times you will have to sacrifice one or the other. You may have to sacrifice your depth of field. You may have to sacrifice your motion blur. But you can find a way to balance those things out and get the image that works best for what you're trying to do. And if you're aware of both of these things and how they work together, that becomes a little easier to do. All right, we've got size, we've got speed, we've got exposure. The next visual thing we need to talk about is going to be color. And the only place to start with color is going to be white balance. White balance is how your camera defines every single color it sees. One of the things to understand about the way cameras work is they are just recording the reflection of light. And different lights exist at different color temperatures. Fluorescent light looks different than sunlight, looks different than tungsten light. All of those things. And so when you're setting your camera's white balance, what you're doing is you are telling it what lighting condition it is existing in so that it can balance out all of those colors. Because it's one of the things that you need to know is that unlike paint, light's primary colors are going to be red, blue, and green. And when you combine all of those colors, they actually make white. And so when you're white balancing the camera, you're telling it what white looks like so that it can extrapolate those other colors and you get a true-to-life image that you're recording. And it's really important to set your white balance because if you don't, editing is going to be really freaking hard. And you know, on DSLRs and mirrorless cameras, most of them have presets that you can use. Those presets work great. If you're using a camcorder or a studio camera, they may have a manual white balance that you have to set. If you're using the presets, that's fine. If you're doing a manual white balance, please do make sure that you're white balancing on actual white and not like taupe or beige or whatever, because it will change all of your colors. And just for fun, what happens when we white balance on red? What happens when we white balance on blue? How about green? Yeah, so you can see that you really want to white balance on white, because if you don't, it throws all of your colors off in a very weird way. All right, we've got white balance out of the way. Now we're talking about your picture or color profile. And this is the last thing I'm talking about as part of this video. We'll talk about audio and other things in a different video. This is more about the visual functions of your camera. So your color or picture profile is one of those things that every camera existing in the modern world has at least a few of these. And they're going to range from flat or neutral, which is very low contrast, very low saturation, all the way up to vivid, which is going to be very high contrast and very high saturation. There are advantages and disadvantages to working in both worlds, right? So if you're shooting flat or neutral, which is what I always do, you are going to have more flexibility in your edit to fine-tune those things, your contrast, your color, right? Those are things that you'll be able to manipulate in post. But if you don't want to do that, or if you're not sure about your skills doing that, you may want to lean more towards the vivid side of things. The downfall of the vivid side of things is that you have much less flexibility when you're editing. It's going to lock in whatever it locks in, and you're kind of stuck with that. You can always add more contrast, you can always add more color, but you can't really remove contrast without it making your image look funky. So then the question becomes, well, if I'm getting started, where should I work? And the answer is in the middle. Most cameras are going to have a standard profile that you can shoot in that will be sort of the best of both worlds, right? It won't be hyper contrasty, but it won't be so bland that you're not sure what to do with it once you get it into the editing environment. And then from there you just start playing and you develop your own sort of editing style, the way you want things to look. You develop your own workflow, and once you have all those things kind of down and pat, you can figure out where you really want to work moving forward. And yeah, that would be the basic functions you need to understand about your camera to start getting good, or at least visually pleasing, video recorded on it. And I promise you, while I know these do take some time and practice to really sort of master and get a grip on, once you do, you will never shoot in auto again, because you will be furious at the lack of control you have when you're doing that. So that's it. That's my video. Thanks for watching. Keep shooting.